I knew the HOA had it out for me, but I never thought they'd go this far. When I pulled out of my driveway that morning, ready to head to work, I slammed on the brakes. My street was blocked. Not by construction, not by a broken-down car, but by a pile of absolute junk old furniture, broken appliances, even a rusted-out swing set. Right in the middle of the road. I shoved the truck into park and climbed out, my fists clenching. That's when I spotted her, Paula Morris, the HOA president, standing smugly on the sidewalk with her arms crossed. "What the hell is this, Paula?" I waved at the mess. She gave me that condescending little laugh she always did. "Oh, Richard, you really should have read the new community guidelines. We've decided to implement stricter aesthetic standards and all residents must comply. Since you refused to follow the rules, we had to take corrective action." I took a step closer. "You blocked a public road with garbage because you don't like the way my house looks." She didn't even blink. "You've refused to repaint your garage door the approved shade of autumn sand. You were given multiple warnings. This is my property, Paula. You don't own the damn street." "Oh, but we influence the neighborhood and we have full support from the board." I glanced around. A few of my neighbors had stepped outside, watching the scene unfold. Some looked amused, others nervous. They knew better than to get involved. The HOA had a way of making life miserable for anyone who stepped out of line. But I wasn't just anyone. "You've got 5 minutes to move this junk or I'm calling the sheriff," I said. Paula just smiled. "Go ahead." I'd love to see how law enforcement reacts when they hear you've been in violation of community standards for months. I pulled out my phone and made the call. If she thought I was bluffing, she was about to get a very rude awakening. The sheriff's deputy arrived quicker than I expected. A squad car rolled up, lights flashing but no sirens, and a tall, no-nonsense officer stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable as he took in the mess clogging the street. Paula folded her arms, standing her ground while I pointed to the blockade. The deputy's gaze flickered between us. "Got a call about an obstruction," I nodded. "Yeah, this pile of junk was dumped here by the HOA. Paula here decided to block a public road because she doesn't like my garage door color." Paula's lips curled slightly, but she kept her voice even. "Deputy, this is a neighborhood matter. Mr. Richard has been in violation of community aesthetics, and the board took action in accordance with our bylaws." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Your bylaws don't override city ordinances. Blocking a public road is an infraction at best, criminal at worst." Paula's confidence wavered for a second before she regained her composure. "We were simply enforcing our community's standards." The deputy pulled out a notepad. "And who exactly authorized this?" Paula hesitated just long enough for me to step in. "The board did, or at least Paula claims they did, but I doubt there's a single piece of paperwork backing that up." The deputy turned back to her. "Is that true? Did the board vote on this, or is this something you decided on your own?" A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she straightened her shoulders. "The board entrusted me with enforcing compliance. It was a necessary measure." The officer let out a slow breath, clearly unimpressed. "Necessary or not, this is illegal. If the city decides to pursue charges, you could face fines or worse. I suggest you get this cleaned up immediately before I escalate this further." Paula's face tightened, but she was trapped. The neighbors watching from their porches were whispering now, and I could see some of them pulling out their phones. She knew she was losing control of the situation. She turned to one of the board members lingering nearby. "Get a crew together. I want this removed immediately." The man hesitated, clearly unnerved. "But Paula, now," she snapped. I crossed my arms. "And I assume the HOA will be covering any damages caused by their little stunt." Paula's jaw clenched, but before she could argue, the deputy spoke again. "That would be the right course of action." She sucked in a breath, clearly seething, but nodded stiffly. "We'll discuss it at the next board meeting." That was good enough for now. I stepped back as a few reluctant HOA volunteers started dragging pieces of junk off the road. The deputy gave me a nod before heading back to his car, satisfied that things were being handled. But I wasn't done with Paula, not by a long shot. As they worked, I pulled out my phone and started recording a message for the neighborhood group chat. I made sure to capture the mess, the sheriff's involvement, and the fact that Paula had just been forced to back down. People needed to see this. If she thought she could bully me into submission, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. By the time the road was cleared, the video had already started making waves. Residents were commenting, sharing, and expressing their frustration. It was clear I wasn't the only one who had been dealing with the HOA's ridiculous power plays. Later that evening, I sat back with a cold drink and watched as the real fallout began. People were digging into the HOA's finances, questioning past fines, and demanding transparency. Then, someone dropped a bombshell, a lead on something much bigger. Apparently, Paula and a few of her board members had been misusing HOA funds for personal expenses. Lavish dinners, vacations, even car payments. And now the neighborhood wanted answers. Paula had picked the wrong guy to mess with, and I was about to make sure she regretted it. Paula was losing control, and she knew it. The neighborhood group chat had exploded with outrage after my video, and people were digging deeper into the HOA's financials. Someone had unearthed records showing that HOA dues had been covering more than just landscaping and community events. There were charges for high-end restaurants, spa treatments, and even what looked like personal travel expenses. It was worse than I had expected. I wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. I spent the next day gathering everything I could find. Screenshots, transaction records, even a few anonymous tips from neighbors who had been suspicious for a while, but were too afraid to speak up. There was enough here to warrant serious legal trouble for Paula and her crew. By the time the HOA's emergency board meeting was announced, word had spread like wildfire. The meeting was supposed to be closed to non-board members, but that rule wasn't stopping anyone. When I arrived at the community center, it was packed. Residents filled the seats, stood along the walls, and even crowded outside the doors. There was tension in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. Paula sat at the head of the table, her usual arrogance replaced with a forced calm. The other board members looked uneasy, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. They knew they were in trouble. One of the residents, a retired accountant named Linda, stood up with a stack of papers in her hands. "I have a question," she said. "Can you explain why nearly $20,000 of HOA funds have been spent at high-end restaurants over the last year?" Paula's fingers drummed against the table. All expenses were approved in accordance with board policies. These were for community engagement events. Linda flipped through the pages. Community engagement, because I don't recall any of us being invited to steak dinners at five-star restaurants. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Another resident, a young father named Mark, held up his phone. "And what about the luxury resort booking in Florida? The one charged to the HOA's account, was that for community engagement too?" Paula's carefully controlled expression cracked for a moment before she forced a smile. "We take annual retreats to discuss neighborhood improvements." That was it. I pushed forward, holding up my own set of documents. "Enough of the excuses, Paula. This isn't just questionable spending, it's fraud. You've been siphoning HOA funds for personal use, and everyone here deserves to know where their money has been going." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One, a nervous-looking man named Greg, cleared his throat. I wasn't aware of these charges. I just approved what Paula put in front of us." Paula shot him a look so sharp it could cut glass. "Greg, this is not the time to," but Greg wasn't backing down. "No, Paula, I'm not taking the fall for this. If what they're saying is true, I want a full audit." That was the moment the floodgates opened. Residents started shouting, demanding answers, calling for resignations. Paula's control over the room was slipping fast. Then someone else spoke up, a lawyer named Jeff who lived down the block. "I've already contacted a legal team. If this is as bad as it looks, the HOA could face lawsuits. And Paula, you personally could face criminal charges." For the first time, real fear flickered across Paula's face. She opened her mouth, probably to deny everything, but the crowd wasn't having it. A vote was called on the spot. The residents had had enough. Paula and most of the board were officially removed, effective immediately. But that wasn't the best part. With Paula gone, the new interim board started going through the HOA's assets, trying to recover the misused funds. That's when they uncovered something interesting. Paula had used HOA money to lease 2 luxury sports cars under the association's name. Since they were technically community property now, the board decided to sell them off to reclaim some of the lost money. And guess who put in the highest bid for one of them? That's right, me. A week later, I was driving down the street in one of Paula's former prized sports cars, the same car she used to flaunt in front of everyone. The neighborhood was in better hands, people were finally speaking up, and justice had been served. Paula had tried to control the neighborhood with fear and manipulation. But in the end, all she'd done was hand me the keys to her downfall. With Paula dethroned and the HOA in shambles, the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had once kept their heads down were now openly discussing all the shady dealings they had endured under Paula's reign. Stories of bogus fines, selective enforcement, and intimidation tactics poured out. It was like a dam had broken, and the community was finally free to air its grievances without fear of retaliation. But Paula wasn't one to go down quietly. About a week after the board removed her, I noticed a sleek black sedan parked near the entrance of the neighborhood. It wasn't anyone's car that I recognized, and something about it felt off. The driver never got out, just sat there watching. A few days later, I spotted the same car again, this time parked further down the street, engine idling. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Mark, the young father from the meeting, walked over one evening while I was washing my truck. "You seen that car?" he asked, nodding toward the sedan parked a few houses down. "Yeah," I said, flicking the sponge into the bucket. "Been hanging around for a few days now." "You think it's someone from the HOA?" Mark frowned. "If it is, they're not doing a great job of being subtle." We decided to get a closer look. As we approached, the driver, a man in a suit and sunglasses, noticed us and immediately pulled away. We watched as he drove toward the exit, disappearing around the corner. "That's not normal," Mark muttered. "No, it's not. I had a bad feeling, and I wasn't about to ignore it. That night, I installed new security cameras around my property." Paula might have lost her position, but if she thought she could intimidate me, she was going to be disappointed. The next day, the new HOA board called for a meeting to go over financial recovery efforts. Linda, the retired accountant, had been digging through the books and found more than just the expensive dinners and vacations. There were discrepancies in vendor payments, inflated maintenance costs, and missing funds that had been disguised under vague categories. "We're looking at upwards of $80,000 unaccounted for," Linda announced to the room. "And that's just what we've found so far." The room erupted. Residents were furious. Some had suspected that HOA funds were being mismanaged, but no one had imagined it was this bad. "Can we go after Paula for this?" someone asked. Jeff, the lawyer, nodded. "Absolutely. There are legal avenues to recover stolen funds, and if enough evidence points to criminal activity, authorities can get involved." I leaned back in my chair, watching the board members exchange uneasy glances. They knew this wasn't just about recovering money. This was about setting a precedent, making sure no one ever tried to pull something like this again. Then, the door opened, and the room fell silent. Paula strolled in like she still owned the place. She wore a crisp blazer, her hair perfectly styled, but there was no mistaking the tension in her posture. She had heard the discussion, and she wasn't happy. "You people have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can just dig through financial records and make accusations. You don't understand how these things work." Linda stood up, unshaken. "Actually, I do, and what I see is fraud." Paula's lips pressed into a thin line. "Everything the board did was legal. We acted in the best interest of the community." "Best interest?" I scoffed. "You mean funneling HOA money into your personal bank account?" Her head snapped toward me. "You have no proof of that." Jeff cleared his throat. "Actually, we do. And if you've been paying attention, you'd know that the law doesn't take kindly to financial misconduct involving HOA funds." For the first time, real panic flashed in Paula's eyes. She opened her mouth to argue, but the weight of the room was against her. Then, the cherry on top. Greg, the once spineless board member who had approved her expenses, stood up. "I want to cooperate with the investigation," he said. "I didn't know how bad it was, but I'm not going down for this." Paula's face drained of color. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, but the damage was done. The board voted to escalate the case to law enforcement, and an official complaint was filed the next morning. As for the mysterious black sedan, it stopped showing up. Maybe Paula had hired someone to keep tabs on the neighborhood, or maybe she had been trying to intimidate me specifically. Either way, it didn't matter. A few weeks later, Paula was officially under investigation. The new board had taken control, and reforms were being put in place to prevent this kind of corruption from happening again. Transparency measures, financial audits, and community votes on major expenditures were now the norm. And as for me, I made sure to take my newly acquired sports car for a leisurely drive past Paula's old house, just to remind her exactly how things had turned out. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free. Paula's downfall should have been the end of it, but the mess she left behind was bigger than anyone expected. The financial hole she had dug meant the HOA was scrambling to recover funds, and while the new board was working hard to clean things up, they were still dealing with the fallout. One afternoon, I was out in the driveway detailing the sports car I had won when Mark came jogging up, his face tight with concern. He stopped short, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening before speaking. "You might want to come to the next board meeting," he said. "Some of Paula's old allies are trying to twist things around. They're saying the investigation was a witch hunt and that the community overreacted." I straightened, wiping my hands on a rag. "They're really trying to defend her after everything," Mark exhaled sharply. "Not outright, but they're playing the we need to move on card, acting like this whole thing was just a misunderstanding." That was exactly the kind of nonsense I had been expecting. Paula might have been removed, but some of the people who had supported her were still lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity to regain control. A few days later, I walked into the meeting hall and immediately felt the tension. The crowd was split. Some people were eager to see reforms continue, while others had clearly bought into the idea that Paula's removal had been too aggressive. At the front of the room, Greg sat in the chair that had once belonged to Paula. He had stepped up to help stabilize things after her removal, and while he wasn't the strongest leader, he at least wasn't corrupt. Still, he looked uneasy as he addressed the crowd. "We need to discuss our next steps," Greg began, glancing at the stack of documents in front of him. "There are proposals to change how the HOA operates, but there's also concern about how we move forward without creating more division." Before he could continue, a woman from the audience stood up. She was one of Paula's longtime supporters, someone who had conveniently stayed quiet when things first unraveled but now seemed emboldened. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice carrying through the room. "We've spent weeks digging through old records, pointing fingers. It's time to put this behind us and focus on making the neighborhood better." Murmurs of agreement rippled through a small section of the audience, but I wasn't about to let that slide. "The only way to make the neighborhood better is to make sure this never happens again," I said, stepping forward. "Paula stole from all of us. That's not something you just move on from." The woman's expression tightened. "Paula did a lot for this community. Maybe she made mistakes, but she also kept things running." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "Kept things running. She used HOA funds to pay for her vacations, her car, and who knows what else. If someone robbed a bank, would you say they kept the bank running just because they left some money behind?" A few people chuckled, while others nodded in agreement. The woman wasn't deterred, though. She turned her focus to Greg. "The new board is wasting time and money on this investigation," she said. "We should be using our resources to fix the neighborhood, not go on a crusade." Greg hesitated, clearly caught between wanting to maintain order and not wanting to look weak. That's when Linda, the retired accountant, stood up. "We're not on a crusade," she said firmly. "We're making sure this community is protected from abuse. And if you're so eager to move on, maybe you should ask yourself why." The woman's face flushed, but before she could respond, Jeff, the lawyer, leaned forward in his chair. "The investigation isn't just about Paula," he said. "It's about every board member who turned a blind eye, every shady deal that was made under the table. If we don't fix this now, what's stopping the next person from doing the same thing? The room fell silent. The people who had been pushing to sweep things under the rug suddenly looked less confident. Greg cleared his throat. The board is committed to seeing this through. No funds will be spent without full transparency, and we will ensure that every resident has a say in major decisions moving forward. That was enough to settle the room, at least for now. But I knew this wasn't over. After the meeting, as I walked to my car, I spotted a familiar figure lingering near the entrance. Paula. She wasn't bold enough to walk inside, but she stood just outside the building, watching. When she saw me looking, she turned to leave, but I wasn't about to let her slink away unnoticed. I took a few steps closer. Still hanging around, Paula? Thought you'd be too busy dealing with your legal troubles. She stopped, turning just enough to meet my gaze. Enjoy your little victory while you can, I tilted my head. That sounds like a threat. You really want to add intimidation to your list of crimes. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she walked to her car and drove off. I wasn't sure what she was planning, but I wasn't worried. The community had seen the truth, and no matter what she tried, she wasn't getting her power back. As I drove home in the sports car that had once been hers, I couldn't help but smile. Paula had spent years controlling this neighborhood, thinking she was untouchable. Now, she was nothing more than a bitter ex-HOA president with no authority and a pile of legal troubles. And I had a front row seat to watch her downfall. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. The HOA, once a tool of fear and control, was now under the leadership of people who actually cared about the community. Linda spearheaded the financial audits. Jeff ensured every legal loophole was closed. And Greg, while still a bit uncertain, was doing his best to keep things running smoothly. But Paula, she wasn't done stirring up trouble. The first sign came when a few residents received letters unsigned, but obviously written by someone with an axe to grind. The letters accused the new board of being incompetent, claimed the financial investigation was a waste of time, and warned that without strong leadership, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. People weren't buying it. If anything, it only made them more determined to see the cleanup through. Then one morning, I woke up to find something strange at the end of my driveway. A bright orange notice, taped to a wooden stake driven into the ground. It was an official-looking document claiming that my property was in violation of community standards and subject to immediate fines. The problem? The HOA had suspended all fines while they audited past enforcement. There was no way this was real. I yanked the notice off and marched over to Greg's house. He answered the door with a tired look, like he had been dealing with nonsense all morning. "Let me guess," he said, eyeing the paper in my hand. "You got one too." I stepped inside, where a small stack of identical notices sat on his kitchen table. "These showed up overnight," he explained, "and they all have Paula's handwriting." I wasn't surprised. She had lost her position, her influence, and her access to HOA funds, but she still thought she could control the neighborhood. "She's desperate," I said. "She knows the investigation is closing in." Greg nodded. "We're filing an official complaint with the city." "This is harassment." That wasn't enough for me. Paula had spent years making life miserable for everyone around her. It was time to make sure she could never pull something like this again. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I could find: emails, past violations, financial records, even testimonies from residents who had been bullied by Paula's HOA tactics. Then, I made an appointment with a city investigator. The meeting was in a small office downtown, where a no-nonsense woman named Rachel listened carefully as I laid everything out. She took notes, asked pointed questions, and by the time I finished, she looked thoroughly unimpressed not with me but with Paula. "This is a pattern of abuse," Rachel said, flipping through the documents. "And if she's still trying to enforce non-existent HOA rules, that could be considered fraud." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. The city opened an official investigation, and within a week, Paula was served with a legal notice. She had been caught impersonating an HOA official, attempting to collect fines and violating multiple housing regulations. But the best part: The new board had successfully recovered enough of the stolen funds to start reimbursing residents for illegitimate fines. People were finally getting their money back. Paula, on the other hand, was facing serious charges. The day after the legal notice was served, I saw a moving truck in front of her house. She wasn't just out of power, she was leaving the neighborhood entirely. I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching as she loaded the last of her things. She noticed me, hesitated, then walked over. "You think you've won," she said, her voice tight with barely concealed anger. I didn't bother hiding my satisfaction. "I don't think I know," she scoffed. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me." I shook my head. "No, Paula, it's finally free." She didn't have a comeback for that. Without another word, she turned and climbed into her car. Moments later, she was gone. The HOA was finally in good hands, the community stronger than ever, and as I leaned against the sports car that had once been hers, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetic justice of it all. Paula had spent years using her position to control and manipulate, thinking she was untouchable. Now, she had nothing.